welcome again from my side. Today, I'm going to talk about what is sustainability from different perspectives, looking at what is land management, biodiversity, and ecosystem services, and what that it means to take a social-ecological approach in research. So yes, I would like to start by a very simple question that I hope, I guess many of you have heard about the term sustainability, right? I would like to maybe ask you to maybe you want to share how you understand this term. Maybe you can answer, so write your answers in the chat. And Simon may start to read some of these ideas that you have in mind, and yeah, just to start a bit, to know a bit what are your thoughts about this term.
Okay, don't be shy. Chit, what is your understanding of sustainability? Let us know.
But there is a figure already in there, so that can give you some hints. But well, if there is no people active at this time of the evening, I can just explain very quickly how it was defined already almost 40 years ago. No, this term was already existing, but it was coined and it was kind of mainstream since then. And it was summarized in a very simple sentence that I guess many of you have heard, no? Which is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This initial concept of sustainability encompasses three main aspects. No, one is the economic aspect, meaning that of course it has to allow a durable economic development, but this has to be sustainable in the terms also from the social perspective. No, meaning that the welfare derived from these activities should also be equitably distributed. And the important aspect of this term, it was that it included environmental perspective, highlighting the importance of consider every economic and social activity within the natural resources and without compromising the regeneration and the use of of our environment. However, after this term was established, the United Nations developed in 2015 a series of more concrete goals about how to achieve what is sustainable development. And probably many of you are also familiar with this, with the 17 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals that are that we want as a society achieve by 2013. So we are getting close to the date. There are different studies trying to assess how far are we in reaching some of the goals. But what is interesting is of this approach is that it gives more concrete actions and also examples of how can we become more sustainable, or how can we achieve this sustainable development. I especially like a representation of this SDGs, which is the short term for the Sustainable Development Goals, that was presented by the Stockholm Resilience Center. And they represented this in this, what they call a wedding cake, or the 3 rings. And it shows, again, the 3 spheres that we have been, that was in the initial definition, the economical, the societal, and the environment, or here named the biosphere. And they identify which are the goals that are most related to each of these spheres and how one is encompassing the other. So we have the biosphere encompassing all the other goals, and the goals that are highlighted here are the land on life and below water, but also clean water and sanitation and climate action. And these 4 goals are overarching to other society goals, no, like no hunger, or peace, or equity, etc. And this, within the societal goal, then the economic goals are also inside. No, so I think it also shows a clear kind of not a hierarchy in preference, but like how some goals are embedded in others. And the 17 is like partnership for the goals. So meaning that, of course, there should be collaboration among all. And just to close with this aspect of sustainability, there are many other concepts not related to this terminology that maybe you have also heard or even used. For example, one of them is the ecological footprint. And I found interesting also to share this graph developed by the Earth Observation Overshoot Day. We try to represent the amount of land and the amount of resources that are needed to meet the human needs as a global aspect. And it's shown here, like in the 70s, we were kind of achieving or reaching our supply need within the possibilities of the Earth, but increasingly we demand more and more resources that our Earth is able to provide, and reaching to the point that in the last year we needed like more than 1.5 Earth planets to provide the resources that we need to our consumption. So that makes also it's a way also to reflect about land management practice, about what is sustainability. And that exactly brings me to the main topic of my research, which is land management. And I again would like to ask you what you understand by land management. And I don't know if someone now is more willing to maybe share what they understand by land management. Or I'll give some examples, for example. Maybe you can type some of these ideas in the chat.
Maybe I can tell you what two people actually wrote about the last question, just to come back to this.
Yes, sure.
So I think it's nice. To me, it's about a livable future is comment number one. And comment number two is ensuring a good life for everybody without accessing planetary borders or boundaries.
Great. I like a lot of these definitions, and actually I'm also gonna pick on this topic of planetary boundaries just in a minute. So yeah, so these are very, very well aligned. Okay, so about land management, of course, that can be defined in many ways, but how I use it in my work is about the process of managing the use and the development on the land resources, both in urban and rural settings. And there are similar words that are used in relation to this topic, like land management, land use intensity, and land use intensification, but we should not confound each other, because with land management, we refer to the practices that we are applying in a particular place or setting to use the space or the resources around us. And land use intensity, on the contrary, is more like a measure of the level of an index of intensity of this use. It can be low land use intensity or high land use intensity. And the third term that I wanted to highlight is land use intensification, that it actually refers more to the process of change. So it has been studied also, for example, that a particular plot of land has become intensified when we change, for example, from a rain-fed agriculture to artificial irrigation systems, for example, or when a grassland is, we added fertilizers, for example, to a plot of land. So this is the process that happened within a single plot. Yes, I also wanted to question why it is interesting to look at land management, and if this is as relevant as climate change, because there are, of course, a lot of actions for climate change, but many studies have shown already since the year 2000 that land use and land use change is mainly one of the main drivers of change in biodiversity. And when this is paired to climate change, so the effects are synergistic or even more dramatical. So these two drivers combined have much larger effects. And coming back to this term of planetary boundaries, it's also shown in this figure that I put here. This concept of planetary boundaries is related a bit also to this ecological footprint, in the term that the researchers working on this topic investigated for a number of indicators, like, for example, biosphere integrity, climate change, land use change, freshwater use, etc., which were the natural capacity of the Earth to provide those aspects, and the amount of use that we have in our society. And they identify this kind of blue ring here, that would be that the use that is within these lines, within the blue line, would be within what is below the boundary, what the Earth can provide in a safe manner. What the use that is above this blue line and before the red ring would be in a zone of uncertainty, that we don't know what can be the consequences of that. When we are in the red zone, like, for example, the use of biogeochemical flow like nitrogen, or the loss of genetic diversity that show here, it's indicated as we are above, so beyond the zone of uncertainty, and we don't know what can be the consequences for that. And these two aspects are very much related to the land use. The use of nitrogen and the loss of diversity are one of the kind of the cause and consequences of these land use types. So how can we then measure this indicator, this land management? So of course there are many ways of measuring it. A common one has been, for example, to investigate the change in land use. Just simply, for example, by looking at the type of vegetation, as I saw in this figure. So in this figure, we can observe, for example, since the pre-settlement times, how the proportion of the landscape at a global scale has been changing. And we observed that, kind of, if we consider that initially there were natural ecosystems, there were kind of a clearing frontier, then there was a period of subsistence agriculture and small-scale farms, and then this was at the same time that the first settlements, so the first urban areas started to appear in our world. And then there was a period of increasing and very accelerated development of the agriculture, intensive agriculture. And currently we can consider that we are in a time where we have a small proportion of natural ecosystems, also very small proportion of subsistence agriculture and small-scale farm, and a large part of our landscape is dedicated to intensive agriculture. There are also, of course, urban areas and some protected or recreational land. So this is a way of assess changes in land management and land use intensification of the land. Other more concrete indicators for land use intensity is just the amount of fertilization. So for example, the nitrogen inputs, or the yield productivity, because both of these variables are related. And this is more from a crop perspective, but in the forest, for example, we can also use different attributes of the forest to assess this amount of land use intensity, and other indices, like, for example, one that is very common is the human appropriation of natural primary productivity. So how much of the primary productivity of the plants is appropriated for human use. So not only former studies have researched the importance of land management, but also the most recent global assessment of the International Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is the IPBES platform, that probably many of you know. And if not, I would really recommend you to check online the resources provided by IPBES, because they have lots of materials, infographics, materials that could be also useful for teaching and education in relation to the effects of not only of land management, but in general about the status of biodiversity and the main drivers of biodiversity loss. Yeah, so I recommend this material. Something that come out very clearly in this global assessment of 2019 is the main driver of global declines in nature is land and sea use change and direct exploitation, no? Which are the two main components of land management. And this is true not only for terrestrial, but also for freshwater and marine ecosystems. So across all ecosystem, land use, it's one of the main drivers of these declines in nature. And this is underpinned by a set of indirect drivers that are related to change in the demographic and cultural aspect, economic and technological, institutions and governance, conflicts and epidemics. So different socioeconomic drivers are behind the more management drivers. And this is also shown very clearly in this other study by developed in 2015, I think, where a group of researchers also from the Stockholm Resilience Center developed a study investigating changes in the last couple of centuries, so since the 1750s to 2010, and how the different trends have been evolving through time. No? For example, we observe a change in population and also urban population, the use of primary energy, of water, transportation, has been increasing exponentially, but not only the socioeconomic trends, also the Earth system trends, so more indicators on the environmental aspect, like the concentration of carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide, methane, so different gases in the atmosphere, but also the surface temperature, the loss of tropical forests or amount of domesticated land has been increasing. And this increase has been exponential. And that's why this period or these changes that are happening are called the great acceleration. No? Like the changes are accelerating. Therefore, it's important to take into account that it's not only environmental drivers, but also social and economic drivers are also changing. Therefore, one also of the main conclusions of this study of the ECBA report is that scientific knowledge is not enough alone, no? That to reverse land degradation, we need to work with the stakeholders, we need to engage society, and it's not enough to just to provide evidence for that, but we need action, and this action should involve and engage different stakeholders at different levels, no? What is called the multi-actor intervention. No? And in this way, we could act as a lever point to change the indirect drivers and then the direct drivers that are changing our nature. And examples of these leverage points include, for example, recognize, no, embrace the diverse vision of what is a good life. There is not only one way of thinking, but there are different perspectives. It's also important, of course, to reduce consumption, reduce inequalities, and promote justice and inclusion, use technology more responsibly. But what I find very important also in the context of these seminars is that the base of these pyramids is to promote education and knowledge generation and sharing, meaning the important role of teaching and education to act as a leverage point to reverse these negative trends in nature. No? So this perspective of engaging, of combining, of taking into account both the social and ecological aspects, it's also understood as a social ecological system, because for long, or for in some context, many times the social system and the environmental system are studied as independent entities, while in reality we know that there is a mutual interdependence. It's not only about the ecological knowledge exchange, understanding, but also mutual influence. And for example, in this figure, it shows how of course, the local system is embedded in a larger system or regional system, same as the local management practices are embedded in particular institutions, and these are nested also at a higher scale. No? And what are the implications for that? is shown in a more simplified version of these schemes, where we have that the group of the human system, and so from the level of the individual groups or institutions, perform different actions or interventions in our ecosystem, for example, like logging, fishing, but also protecting on conserving nature. And that's going to affect the ecosystem, this is their structure and the functions. And in return, there is a feedback loop back to the human system in the terms of ecosystem services. This is a key term that I'm going to use in my research, and I would like to explore more in detail. So what are these ecosystem services? What is this flow back from the ecosystem to the human system? And that's something I wanted to ask you. I don't know if someone has, some of you have heard the term ecosystem service in advance, and how would you understand this concept? Maybe you can to write again in the chat.
Okay, once again, don't be shy. Actually, again, 2 comments came on the last question. Maybe we just need to wait those 10 seconds longer.
Okay, I wait longer, no worries.
And how is the audio for you? Is it loud enough? Yes or no? Because one person said that the voice is low on her computer.
Okay, sorry, I can't get closer to my microphone. Maybe it's...
Yeah, maybe that...
It was fine. I can hear you fine here. So there's no
Okay.
real reason to start shouting.
Okay.
Oh.
Sound is great.
Yeah.
Someone else is saying, okay, so then otherwise we will share on the YouTube channel of VBio, we will share this afterwards. Okay. So about the feedback, any ideas? Okay, an example. Intensive agriculture leads to a decline in pollinators, which leads to reduced plant pollination, affecting the human system.
Yeah. Clearly. Yeah, great.
Good example.
Yeah. Okay, so it seems that the term, at least by some, is no, maybe not by others, and it is fine. So this term was defined already in 2005 as the direct or indirect benefits that people obtain from ecosystems, as, for example, provisioning services such as timber or food, cultural services, for example, as recreation or relaxation, a place to disconnect from daily workloads. Also regulating services, as, for example, the provision of fresh water and the regulation of climate hazards, of extreme hazards. And these are underpinned by supporting services, such as, for example, the soil formation or the soil fertility that allow the others to exist. And the interesting link of this study from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is that they link these different ecosystem services to the different components of well-being, to show how people is dependent from the ecosystem services in terms of how this can affect our security, but also the provision of basic material for good life, also our health, it is the good social relations, and of course the freedom of choice and action. And I would highlight that especially the links between ecosystem services and biodiversity and health are becoming increasingly understood, and this is a novel, well, not a novel, but interesting research pathway. And I wanted to show something else about how now we measure this, how we assess these ecosystem services. And this is shown in this other figure, where we are representing how the ecosystem services here in the middle as a link, from the ecosystem to the social system. I wanted to highlight the 3 different dimensions of how can we understand or how can we assess this concept of ecosystem services. On the one hand, we have the biophysical value domain, why we would, for example, assess the amount of, so the biodiversity in terms of genotypes, species, communities, or even the functional diversity, and how this is contributing to different ecosystem functions, which is the capacity of supply a service. No, for example, like the capacity of the river to depurate water, for example. No, this is ecological function. And in this case, we would be exactly within this supply side part of the demand. What is provided, what is supplied by the ecosystem? That can be a way to assess ecosystem services. But we can also look at the ecosystem services from the social perspective, which would be more the demand side. What is demanded by people? What are the demands or the requests of people from our nature? And this is, of course, in relation to the contribution of the ecosystem services to human well-being and to the value that it can be attached to people. And then this value can be, again, assessed or measured in two different ways. One, from more a socio-cultural perspective, we could ask, for example, what is the importance that people attach to ecosystem services, so giving a relative ranking of priorities or preferences. There is another aspect to it, which is the monetary valuation, which is the total economic value of use or not use value. So I have to say that the concept of ecosystem services was initially developed from environmental economists, ecological economists. So this part was mostly developed, and this was on the idea of highlighting how economically important is protecting nature. However, it had also some constraints, because by highlighting the monetary aspect, other aspects of the ecosystem, other services of the ecosystem that are not well captured by economic terms were not considered or taken into account. No? So that had also other pitfalls, and that led to the development of other techniques and methods to assess the social-cultural and the biophysical value domain. And in my work, as I will show later, I will focus especially in these two aspects, which were the least developed, or are still less developed than the monetary approaches. Another advance on this topic of ecosystem services was again brought by the IPES assessment, so this international platform for biodiversity and ecosystem services, which have developed a number of stakeholder engagement rounds by trying to bring back this concept of ecosystem services to local communities across different parts of the world. They have realized that this terminology was not well accepted in other cultures, and that was this ecosystem service perspective was very much focused or oriented to Western societies, no? That we understand very well this rationale. And that's why they developed a new terminology, which is called nature contributions to people, that try to embrace a different perspective and different relationship of people with nature, also in terms of how people feel attached to nature, as well as positive and negative aspects of the relationship with nature. And also, for example, this classification that I was giving initially about provisioning cultural and regulating services, it's shown in a much more fluid way in these recent studies, as, for example, aspects such as food and or materials are not only a material contribution to people, what could be a provisioning service, but sometimes these goods are collected for cultural reasons, no? So it has more or spiritual reasons, so it's as a present, so it's more as a non-material contribution to people. For example, the fact of going to the forest to collect mushrooms or pick berries is not always because you need it to eat and to nourish yourself, but it's sometimes more as a recreational activity, no? And again, of course, this contributes to quality of life, not only in an instrumental way, as it was very much highlighted before, but also in a relational way. You know, sometimes what is important is about how you feel in nature, with other people. Okay, so until here it was a bit the introduction to the topic, and I wanted to make a break now and allow for questions. If something of the concept that I was explaining was not clear, please feel free to ask now.
Okay, for this, please use the Q&A function so it's easier for us to see and then also forward the questions to Maria. And while we still wait until you typed in your questions, maybe I can just say something about the live poll that we just did. So there's actually a lot of researchers, bachelor students, master students, PhD students. There's also science professionals here, and there's educators and research managers. For everybody else who said other, I would be interested in what your profession is also, apart from the list that is given. If you're just interested in the topic or how you don't fit into one of those categories. Also, maybe because then in the future I can do a more specific poll. So that would also help me. Okay, so we do have the first question here. And so the question is, how about parasitism? Plasmodium malaria might score low, both in socio-cultural as well as monetary aspects, but it's still part of our surrounding biodiversity. So how would you rate parasitic species?
Yeah, exactly. This is one of the main criticisms that this ecosystem service concept had. And that's why it was in this new concept, which is called nature contributions to people. It includes both the positive and the negative, or the advantage or disadvantages relationship with nature, no? Because we must acknowledge that there are some aspect that we are not so happy about, that, no, some relation with nature, that especially or disease and all these aspects that we are not happy with that. And that's also a way of taking that into account. But it's true that researchers up to now, they identified, but they have not operationalized a way of considering that. On the contrary, what is considered a service, for example, is natural pest control. So if you have the abundance of natural enemies that control for this pest or for this disease, that can be considered an ecosystem service. That is clearly recognized. But the fact of having disease, that is not well taken into the research.
Okay, thank you. And there's feedback for you as well that you did an incredible job on your introduction. It says incredibly insightful yet simple introduction. So I think that might also solve the question why there's no other questions. And I think with this, we're good to go for the next part.
Okay, so now I would like to introduce a bit more concretely the topic of my research, and is on the I tried to combine the different aspects that I was mentioning before: sustainability, ecosystem services, land management, and I focus particularly on the agroecosystems. So agroecosystems are those systems that are managed for agriculture, not only, and for obtaining food and fiber. And they are important because they cover a large part of the terrestrial surface, around 40%, and are highest risk of degradation because of their use. And in relation to this type of ecosystem, where land management is of utmost importance, there are some management practices that can balance the use and allow for a more sustainable use, while other practices would not. Therefore, in this context, I ask myself three main questions. So I try to address three main challenges in relation to global change, and that is always bringing this ecological and the social aspect together. Now, on the one hand, from a more ecological point of view, and thinking in agroecosystems as an ecosystem, I investigate the effect of land management on biodiversity and ecosystem services. On the second part, I will briefly talk also about how we take into account the social ecological interactions. In the third part, I will take a more social perspective, and then thinking instead of agroecosystems, I will think in rural areas, which these are as a social perspective, how these landscapes are understood, and how can we think or promote a more sustainable management of rural landscapes. So in relation to the first one, this was the main question that I asked you, as I am myself. How does land management affect the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem services? And in my early research during my PhD, I was investigating, for example, how different ecosystem services that are listed here, like for example, gas regulation, soil formation, nutrient regulation, habitat quality, food production, raw material production, education and recreation, are provided in a different land use types across a river floodplain. So here, for example, we had from abandoned crops to urban areas, dry cereal crops, forest, fruit crops, irrigated cereal crops, popular crops, and riparian forests. So I was comparing a number of indicators of ecosystem services across a different number of land use types. And what we found is that at plot scale, so at a small scale, a 1 hectare scale, for example, we would have high values for habitat quality and nutrient regulation and education and many services in this riparian forest, while the agricultural lands would provide, of course, food production, but little amount of the other services. However, it was also interesting, so this is the same represented here. Here I just use circular figure to represent the relative contribution of each of these land use types to each of these ecosystem services. As I was saying here, riparian forest, which is this one, contributed to the largest proportion of most of these services, but that was at the patch scale. However, when we were looking at the municipality and landscape scale, we see that for the cultural services, riparian forests were still important, but they had smaller values for others. However, it was important here to look at the dry cereal crops that in our case study covered the largest part of the landscape, meaning that if we want to make a change at the more sustainable change in the management at the landscape scale, we need to look not only at those areas that contribute the most at the small scale, but also that cover largest part of the landscape in order to balance the different land use types and the different management intensities to provide a more balanced set of ecosystem services. Later through my postdoc, I was also focusing mostly in forest, and here I was investigating which aspect of forest management have an effect on a number of different ecosystem services. And there we could identify, mostly 3 main patterns. We could either have like a clear synergistic effect, so all the services would increase with a particular management aspect. We could have also a clear negative effect, with the declines on services, but we could also show trade-offs for some of the services. And I did this exercise for, as we see here, 12 different ecosystem services and 16 different attributes or characteristics of the forest that forest managers can manage for. So, for example, as for example, the mean deviation, which is the size of the tree, or the canopy cover, or the proportion of conifers and oaks or their species, the heterogeneity, vertical and horizontal, depth volume, and regeneration, and the understory and diversity. And there we could see a variety of responses. More interestingly is that we found clear synergies for some measures. So our results clearly show that having larger trees, so largest mean deviates, this is the diameter at the breast height, so this is a measure of the size of the trees, and the vertical heterogeneity, that means that in a forest patch having trees of different sizes, so we have so we have a diversity of shapes in the vertical aspect, has generally an overall positive effect on most ecosystem services. However, other characteristic we could So there are some trade-offs. So for example, having a large canopy cover, so my surface, would benefit services like, for example, carbon storage, or but in them it would decrease other more cultural services. For example, the fact of having understory species that you could harvest blueberries, for example. No, you need some open patches for that. So a complete canopy cover would not benefit those cultural services. So this was interesting to identify which concrete management aspect would benefit one of these of other services, and in this way we could provide more concrete management applications and in practice. So for example, conifer cover would of course contribute to timber production, but would decrease a number of cultural services and regulating services as well. So just to, I wanted to keep short because of the time, just to give you two hints of this part of my study. We could say that sustainable land management practices are essential for biodiversity and people. An increase in land use intensity causes overall declines in biodiversity and services, and that the landscape scale management, so thinking at the landscape scale is fundamental to accommodate the different needs and to mitigate those trade-offs. So the second aspect of my research that I wanted to show is in relation to this interaction, how land management is affecting the human-nature interactions. And here I questioned which are these effects and which is the role of the social and the ecological systems in these interactions. And this is interesting because I'm going to introduce a new concept now, which is the concept of co-production. And this refers to the anthropogenic contributions to ecosystem services. So before I was saying that ecosystem services or nature contributions to people are those benefits that nature provides to people, right? And this is the truth in many cases, of course, but in many other cases, the reality is that we need some kind of human input in order to benefit, in order to use those services. No, one, as is showing this figure, we would only have the natural capital, not the natural the ecosystem aspect, as for example, the wild berries. But when we use some tools or knowledge in order to know that these fruits are edibles, we are already using some anthropogenic assets. And this increase, for example, in the case of plantation, where we have some skill, we have some machinery, and even more, for example, in the case of hydroponic agriculture, that has very little amount of natural capital and is mostly anthropogenic contributions. And we could arrive to a point that everything is human-made and there is no nature in it, so there would not be an ecosystem service at all. These different anthropogenic capitals are shown in this figure. These are basically human, which relates to the knowledge and skills. Social relates more to the social network, the formal or informal institution, the norms and regulation. We have, of course, the physical, which is the technology and materials, and the financial, which is the economic incentives. So the idea, so this concept tried to understand which is the implications for sustainability of the use of the different anthropogenic capitals, and how and how land management practices are dependent of the different capitals, and how this is going to affect, of course, the sustainability of the use of the different services. So we did some research trying to assess the level of knowledge that we have on this concept, and which is the evidence behind the dependence of ecosystem services from these anthropogenic contributions. And what we found is that, of course, for regulating services, which, as I said, is mostly derived from nature, like pollination, freshwater supply, or water purification, there is little human input included, as we could expect. But however, for all the material, and especially for the cultural services, also things like the fact of going to nature for a hike or for a walk, we increasingly need more of human contributions. We need some equipment, we need some paths, we need some transportation, etc. All these are human assets that are also needed for enjoy the services. So in our work, we now want to give a step further and try to link how the use of these different capitals is related to the amount, so to the intensity use of the plots, if this is related to a more intensive use of nature or more extensive use of nature, and also how is this, if this is related, of course, on one. It's another concept what they didn't want to explain is this telecoupling aspect. It means if these services are locally used and consumed, these are produced or used somewhere else. But most interestingly is how we relate that to the values behind the managers of these systems. Is the people managing, for example, a particular grassland move from by more instrumental values, for example, a material or a feed interest, or this is more related to a more relational value? It is more important the relations with nature in the way they manage. So in this work that is just started, we are trying to disentangle the relationship between the use of the different capitals and the dependence of nature with the intensity of the management practices. What to conclude from this aspect of my research is that it is fundamental to combine social and ecological information to understand really the context and to be able to provide sound information for policy making. And of course, this part of research is more challenging, especially for some low-income countries. It's harder to collect not only ecological but also social data at this level of detail. But this data is becoming increasingly available, and it's also important to iteratively monitor these aspects to adapt changes that can happen not only in local conditions but also in local needs. So this type of studies are likely to be developed in the future as well. Just finally, on the third aspect of my work that I wanted to show is more like how can we apply this to the management of sustainable rural landscapes? And here I ask which policies, for example, benefit people and nature, or how can we manage rural landscape for sustainability? And I wanted only to show one example of how this can be applied, and it's through the use of the scenario analysis, which is a very interesting tool for landscape management. And I believe it can also be an interesting tool for teaching and education, as we can play with the students to thinking what are the consequences of different pathways, no, of different development of the scenario, which are the consequences of our management for a number of indicators that we want to assess. And how we work with the scenarios usually is like in three simple steps. So first we define the scope. We first define, for example, which are the axes that we are interested to look at. For example, we want to promote more conservation or less conservation, or intensification, or this is the typical debate, more intensify or less intensify. That could be, for example, the four axes. Then we would develop which are the narrative, what can be the context, which is the situation in each of these four situations. If we increase this axis and we increase this axis, what would be how the landscape would look like? If we increase this one but decrease the other one, how this landscape would look like. So this is a way of playing with the possibilities of the future or alternatives. And then we would identify a number of indicators that we want to assess, not to analyze how these scenarios could affect. Most of the research up to now had been assessing either social or ecological indicators, but there's not many research trying to model both social and ecological components of this scenario management. That's why in our work we try to look for specifically for that, and try to develop management scenarios that are not only for sustainability but also equitable, I mean a fair distribution. I'm going to show an example of how we did that, and in this case we look at a double gradient. Here we have like agricultural intensification gradient from low to high, and here we would have riparian forest restoration gradient. So the current situation is something like in the middle. And in an extreme agricultural intensification, we will have this intensive agriculture scenario, whereas the opposite would be like a rural abandonment scenario. And in the extreme of the riparian forest, we would have a conservation and restoration scenario. And we have also an intermediate case where we call conservation and production. We have some restoration and some intensification. And for each of these scenarios, we assess a number of 16 different ecosystem services that are represented here in the different colors. So for example, in the conservation and restoration, we maximize a number of regulating services and cultural services, but we have no values for the provisioning services. That's of course the opposite in the intensive agriculture, where we have almost no values for most services, but only for those related to production. Current situation it has very low values, and rural abandonment only promotes three services related to the land regeneration, which makes sense, because there is no use of the landscape. And we have an intermediate conservation and production scenario here, which maximize a few services, but doesn't have any minimum values for any of the services. And what we did now is to contrast the effect of these ecosystem services, of these management scenarios on ecosystem services, what the different social actors that are relevant in our study area. So here we identified four main stakeholders, which are the primary sectors like farmers, the recreation sectors like the tourism industry, the tourists themselves, the leisure people, and the institutions. And we represent it in according to the size, if these different stakeholders would benefit or would win or would lose from the different scenarios. And for example, we can see that in the conservation and restoration, three of these icons are in a large size, but the primary sector here is smaller, meaning that they are losing from this situation. On the contrary, farmers would be winning from this intensive agricultural scenario, but the other actors, especially the recreation sector, would be losing. And on the contrary, we have this intermediate scenario where we have the four actors are in the same size, and this size is not a maximum size that we could get, so it's not a strong gain, but it's also not a loss. So what we could derive from this combination is that in both cases, for this study, we found that this intermediate scenario would contribute to improve the current situation regarding ecosystem services without causing any losses to any of the main stakeholder groups. And that's why this is a way that we can use to assess how sustainable and equitable are different land management strategies, to identify, as I say here, the winners and losers of land management. So just to conclude this part, I wanted to highlight that the power asymmetries are a key factor influencing the access to ecosystem services, and that uncovering this is fundamental to achieve equity in the management and access to resources for the human well-being. With that, I'm sorry if I was a bit quick. And in this final part, I didn't want to exceed the time that we have for the talk. And just to give you a few take-home messages from today, just to summarize what I say, like each land use type provides different types and amounts of ecosystem services, and that land management influences both the supply and the distribution of the services. It's important to consider the multiple types of extensive evaluation, the ecological, the social, and the economic, because they provide different and complementary information. Also, it's critical to involve stakeholders in planning for understanding the preferences and the scenario, and to identify these power asymmetries to identify potential inequalities. And I'm going to skip this in more in detail information and simply, yes, thank you a lot for your attention, and here is my contact in case there are some questions that you want to address to me directly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, for this very insightful talk. There's also thanks already in the chat. And I think there's already also some very good questions in the chat and comments, because Especially the last part, I think, is also, you know, when we look at the news lately, I think we're in the EU, there's a huge potential for discussion, which is good. If we still talk to each other. Okay, and I think Martin, he summarized this pretty well in his comment/question. So conflict, biodiversity, and agriculture. I see two main competing strategies. First, intensifying agriculture, more pesticides, more fertilizers, use of GMOs, but they're for reducing land consumption, leading to more yield per area and leaving more space for wildlife and wilderness, however wilderness is defined. And then second, integrated sustainable organic agriculture, less pesticides, less fertilizer, but therefore less efficient production and taking into account a larger consumption of areas. And I think Martin already put this in the chat before you summarized with, you know, with those graphs in the third part already. And I think if I remember correctly from the management scenarios, you said that the current situation has low scores overall. So what is your goal on this?
I have to say that that was done not at a global level, but it was for a particular case study. Maybe that was not clear. That was done for a particular case study. But yeah, I mean, this question is researchers have been asking this question for many years. This was known as this land sharing and land sparing debate. And the thing is that the idea is that it's not either or, like we should not choose and go for one approach simply because it depends on the context, it depends in which situation we are talking. It is not the same in some areas where there are some species that really need to be isolated, not isolated, what I want to say, like they really need intact nature in order to thrive. So they cannot live in a place with low levels of land use intensity. So for some species, if you want to protect them, they really need to be in some protected spaces. But in other cases, for many others, more sustainable management practice or agriculture that is with here less pesticide, less fertilizer, and is compatible with lots of wildlife. So that's why it's not. Yeah, we cannot choose always to go for one approach or the other, because it's not optimum to just put block in nature and have isolated areas for nature alone, and then we intensify the rest. The nature needs to be connected. Species need connection to move from different plots. So it really depends. Both options are needed, and it depends on the context where we apply one or the other. I hope I answered that question. Yeah,
I think it's well answered. And you know, I mean, I think you know, I mean, that's also something that I thought about when I'm hosting this webinar, because you know, this is something that is really also in my mind a lot. So we see you know, we have a Green Deal in Europe, and now we have farmers protesting, and it's normal. You know, we industrialized farming for the past 70 years, and now suddenly.
I don't know what you're talking about from the Netherlands. Yes.
And now suddenly, you know, farmers need to change a lot, and you know, land intensification should be reduced, and then, I mean, yields are less, and then people are earning less, and you know, I mean, this is a very critical point where we're discussing this, I think.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? Because if I look at the current changes in for instance, the Green Deal, I think now we have to be scared that many of the proposed laws will not make it. And I think one of the reasons for that is that, and I have to look at myself as a biologist, we tend to operate in our own silo. So we miss the social context, and we are not able to bring the population in our endeavor to have a sustainable future, which everybody wants, but for some reason we're not able to communicate in a proper manner to the rest of the population.
Mm-hmm.
So because you're on more than one world, so
Yeah.
So can you comment on that?
Yeah. In reality, people is already saying sustainable. Now we use the word sustainability for everything. At the end, it's losing its meaning.
Yeah.
And so people, it's used has been used so much that it's hard for I would say for farmers or for many other people in the industry to understand if they if this is sustainable or not really, no. So that's why I like a bit more the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, because that is a more clear indication of what is the goal, now what is the aim, which is the action that we should be taking to live in a more livable world. Yes,
yeah, totally correct. Yeah, and the other thing, could it be that my impression or impression of someone in the EU, his vision on sustainability and nature is formed by its local community, so that the larger effects are I mean, in Holland we have some industrial farming, right? Not apparently, we have a lot of it, but it's hardly visible.
You mean that in society don't realize that the agriculture they have is industrial?
Yes.
Because they are used to that, no? Because it's the type of farming they have been seeing for like decades. So
yeah, and it's invisible. It is the green lands are not well populated. So where the English raygrass is doing its terrible work, people don't see it because they only see a green pasture and say, "Oh, nice nature. What's the problem?"
Yeah.
How do we? And if you combine that with the local environment, where you see if you're in your local community, you start doing stuff so people experience it, they might also experience the wider picture. But I'm a novice at the subject, so I need people like you to explain it to us. Yes.
I think like by providing information, more information on where the products come from, that's already can alert the consumers of, or at least reconsider how sustainable is that. If we would know, for example, okay, these potatoes, maybe they are grown in Holland, or they are sold in Holland, but maybe they were planted somewhere else, because that happens with vegetables. They are planted in a place and then brought to another country for growing up, and then they are sold again in a third country. So if we could, by increasing traceability of the products, people can start thinking about the sustainability of their choice, and if that is really green or not so green. And also other indicators that we could have, for example, in terms of water quality and things like that. Like we could know how much of these fertilizers that are applied to these green grasses is going to the rivers, and what is the components of that could be.
But that is already a high level of abstraction. So people in the street, would they be able to follow that line of argument?
I don't know, I think that adding more labels to the product that we consume, that could be a way of making that visible at all of it. Also, for example, in terms of labor, if we're thinking which is the type of labor involved in which are the social conditions of the workers of these of different farming environments. No, is this equitable or not? That also can help visualize the issues behind intensive farming.
Yes, and the other thing, I think you highlighted that perfectly, is the enormous amount of conflicting interests of the enormous amount of stakeholders.
Yes, that's the main. I think the main issue of agriculture now is not the farming per se.
Oh.
It is the intermediary. It's all the intermediate industry that is in between the producers and the consumers. If that gap would be reduced, probably it would be easier for farmers to achieve higher kind of fair prices for them, fair prices for the consumer. But then these people in the middle need to look for another job. So that's also a difficult question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, one maybe easy question in between before coming back to more. So there's one, Adrian, he's asking for a book recommendation or for publications on land use, because he's coming from the social sciences. I'm not a biologist by training. Can you recommend a book or publication on land use that might suit people like me to get familiar with research terminology institutions on land use?
Okay, well, as I was saying at the beginning, the IPBES has made a great job in creating content accessible for anyone, so in a very easy to understand language. And there is, for example, a report on land degradation that's very good and has a lot of nice figures that we could this person could, for example, have a look at. I think these are a great source of resources. Okay,
perfect. I think Harm is already searching. Are you? And I just put IPBES into the function, but we can also put this into the chat in a minute or two. Adrian is already saying thanks. Okay, and then there's one question that also has an introductory sentence.
Yes, a link, for example.
Perfect.
This is. But there are many more. There are many assessments that are interesting.
But maybe it's a good starting point, and then one can also look at the sites. Okay, so the next question is, land use activities is highly anthropogenic. My question is, to what extent did anthropogenic factors shape the effect of land use on ecosystem functions in your studies? And will you recommend a change in land use activities that offset the negative impacts on ecosystem services?
If I understand well the question, so you mean if there were, so the first question, the effect of land use services functions in your studies. So for example, we did a study in grasslands, in German grasslands, comparing protected and unprotected grassland and how they would contribute to fodder production on one hand, but also to biodiversity, plant biodiversity. And we found that there was always a negative relationship. So the more land use intensity, so the more fertilizer or amount of cut-off, we would have less plant diversity. But in protected areas, there were the effect of land use intensity on the fodder production was not. So the local conditions play a role. So meaning that in protected areas, same fodder production could be achieved. I'm saying that correctly. The same fodder production could be achieved at low levels of land use intensity. So I mean that it is possible to produce fodder in protected areas as well, no? And that could not, to the protection level and the biodiversity associated to that, would not impair the production of fodder. Okay, that was I don't know if that is.
Yeah, I think that's again connecting to what we discussed before, so that there's that a mixture of both is required.
And recommended change in the land use. Well, the recommended change it of course depends on what you want, no? Like it's but thinking in a from our perspective, decreasing the intensity in the use of the grassland or the landscape in general would allow for a more diverse range of ecosystem services that can be provided. So that would increase the benefits for a larger different number of people and provide more benefits not only for people but also for biodiversity.
Okay. And I think there's one more question about, about the data in those studies. If I just caught the idea of this question correctly. So the ecosystem services model seems to solve the problem of neglecting the full scale of environmental benefits and vulnerabilities. Is or was that only a Western Hemisphere theoretical issue? In other words, were there other well-known models to think about all environmental components and interactions before the ecosystem services model was invented?
So in the Western societies, we had the concept of ecosystem. No, we already have this concept of ecosystem, or the concept of biosphere, the concept of biotope. And so this model of, this idea of taking into account the different aspects was existing. But what was the idea of ecosystem service was invented or developed in order to try to look, they were looking for strategies to how to protect nature, how to convince businesses of the importance of protecting nature. No, because there had been an evolution of how to protect nature. No, before we wanted nature for itself, so we created this clear separation, the national parks and everything else, to separate the nature use from the human use. And then there was this other aspect of nature more like for people. But if we recognize that the nature is beneficial for people, maybe this is another argument for conservation. It turns that it not always work well, because of these economic implications can also be used as you can put a price, you can sell or buy. And that's why now it is tried with the idea is trying more to think in this people in nature, like people should have this idea of a connection to nature. And in other worldviews, that's why this concept of ecosystem service has evolved through to this more nature contributes to people. Other cultures don't have this separation of people for nature or nature gifts or things like that, because they some other cosmovision, they feel themselves as part of nature, so it's a part of themselves. So this separation that can work well in other cultures, and that's why they have to be thinking in other terminologies. For example, you have probably heard about this Mother Earth concept that we use here ecosystem, but we say ecosystem or nature, it's something like separated from a people, But if you say Mother Earth, it's like your mother, so you feel connected to that. So that's why these differences in terminology.
Okay, so you would say it's a Western Hemisphere thing.
The ecosystem service,
because of this separation, yeah.
Yes, Western Hemisphere, yes, yeah. But this terminology is understood by business and the policymaker, because there have been many years already that since these studies started. So the term ecosystem services has kind of deep roots already. So it's going to take a bit of time to try to make people think in this other concept. But so, for example, the people that works with these terms, they choose the term according to the audience. So maybe here in Western or in Europe, the term ecosystem service is well understood and it's easy to communicate to people, but we would go maybe to Latin America or to to New Zealand, to other parts of the world. This term would not resonate with people. So in those cases, they would use other terminology to explain or to talk about these topics.
Harm, were you to say something? No? You're still mute.
If you get me started, I won't stop. So no, it's because it's personal. I just see how society is not seeing what we are seeing, and if we want them to understand, we have to change. So that's the important part. And about the African part of it, I think one of our next speakers will be Antonio Abreu from UNESCO. So and he has a well established connection to Africa. So perhaps he can elaborate a bit more on other cultures and sustainability, how that is going. So if you're sitting here, you might want to hook up on June 18th, I think. It will be the next lecture. Because for some reason, Simon has to take off a month. Yes.
It's parental leave.
Yeah.
We're family friendly still.
Congratulations, yes.
Okay, there's one nice question, I think, in the chat still. So could monitoring of transformation and visibility of increased biodiversity help to change how people perceive intensive agriculture versus agroecosystems?
Yeah, definitely. I believe that the more information we can provide to the public and showing what are the consequences of this favoring change in agricultural practices or different land management practices and effects on different biodiversity levels or groups would be very much informative. That was, for example, it was very famous, well, at least in Germany. There was a publication that was direct from the Natural History Museum that they show declines in insect populations, and that was in the press, and that was revolving a lot of the action. No? Like they could show because of these years and years of accumulating data, monitoring data of the species, that there was a clear decline, no? And so it has a lot of value.
Yeah. Correct.
Or increase. Sometimes there are also increases in other type of species, no? Like invasive species, but that's another topic.
Cool. All right.
Are we doing one more?
Yeah, sure. Because the people type these questions, so let's answer them.
Okay, okay. Maria, are you still with us?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So there's one person asking, what about the conversion of agricultural areas to solar panel areas? I think this is also a very crucial one.
Yeah, there's currently in our group, there is people also doing research on that. And well, I don't think it can be really a substitution. Like you think in solar panels, they provide energy, while agricultural areas, they provide food. So first, we probably need to eat, all of us. And yeah, it has a lot of controversy. There are still not many studies that show what is happening with the soil and biodiversity underneath these solar panels. But what is clear is also that the landscape is being affected. I mean, if you fence all around, that destroys connectivity, and also, well, all the matter with climate will have climate effects for sure, no? Because it's not the same, the reflectivity that you have from plants that from these plates. In my opinion, that's my personal opinion, with no studying the effect of solar panels at all, I think we have many roofs where these plates could be installed. And yeah, it depends on also where it's going to be used and consumed. No, it's also the fact of transportation of the energy. It's also a matter. So I think there are many aspects to take into account. But that would lead, for example, like if we would dedicate European use for energy production, we would need to produce our food somewhere else. That would be in third countries, and that also has other consequences for biodiversity in there, also for social equity, and all these telecouple effects. So it's not a banal question.
Yeah, I mean, exporting our problems it cannot be the solution. If I remember correctly, there's also a few people trying to, have a farming area below the solar panels. So you can, a chicken would always hide anyway. And so maybe...
yeah, and parking places, for example, that's a great solution. So I think there are possibilities of expanding solar panel, but not necessarily in places where we would need to produce food.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Okay, and now Martin is bringing up one important thing again, I think this is going back to the first discussion, or the initial discussion we had in the Q&A now in the end. So I guess farmer is a big specter, is what he's typing in. But every farmer is in need to stay economically alive. So how convincing a local farmer to reduce his or her land use because somewhere else in the EU agriculture is intensified? How should that be negotiated?
Yeah, of course. Like I think the first thing is to ensure that if the farmer has a decent way of living, no, and that they are not dependent on subsidies. That is not really sustainable, no. That's why I think that the whole system needs to be changed, and it's not about reducing per se the production. I think it's more about the way of producing, no, and what is subsidized and what is not, and also, for example, talking to family and friends that are in the farming world is also about the bureaucracy and all the paperwork that they need to do for producing. So it's not. So there are many facets, and I think different farmers complain of a different aspect of all these policies, and it's not the same situation everywhere. No, so the difficulties are different, I think, in every context. But of course, the solution is not just to simply say, "Oh, no, produce less." I think there are many different solutions that can be negotiated with this type of farmer.
If it was easy, we would already have solved it.
Yeah. That's why. But that's the thing, that there is no a one solution fits all. No, that there are many different constellation of situations, and it's difficult to legislate for all at once. So.
Okay, I think these are good final words
Yes.
for this Q&A. I can read from the Q&A again. I got the recommendation for this webinar quite accidentally through 2 forwarded emails. It was a really enlightening discussion, and I'm really glad to have logged on to the Zoom call. Unfortunately, I have to take off now. And hopefully you saw my message, so you can all get our newsletter. Just send me an email. And yeah, thanks for joining, everyone. And Maria, really thanks a lot for this insightful talk. And I'm really happy we have this talk also on our platform to be viewed for other people who couldn't join this evening.
I made a lot of notes. So if you was wondering what I was doing, I was making notes. Yes.
Oh, wow. Thank you. It was a big pleasure also from my side.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay. And Maria, maybe we can just quickly meet in another room. I will send you a link just for a nice get together.
Okay.
All right. There's a lot of thanks coming in.
Yeah, nice. Thanks to all the audience.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to have this discussion with